They mistreated him. They dismissed him. They mocked him with their ignorance, as if he was invisible, unworthy of any respect. Before we continue the story, comment what city you're watching us from. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications if you enjoy stories like this. The restaurant was packed, the noise of clinking silverware and murmurs of high society conversation filling the air. But Jacob Miller, a man who could have bought this entire restaurant 100 times over, stood at the edge of it all, unseen, unnoticed. His uniform was spotless, his hands steady, but to them, he was nothing more than a lowly servant. The customers, draped in their finest clothes, moved through the restaurant like kings and queens, their arrogance painted on their faces. None of them gave him a second glance. None of them cared to see the quiet determination in his eyes. They ordered, they ate, they left. They were powerful, wealthy, and arrogant. And they treated him like he didn't matter. But what they didn't know, what none of them could have known, was that the man they sneered at was hiding a secret so powerful, so life-altering, that it could change everything for them. Jacob Miller wasn't just any waiter. No, he was a billionaire. And not one of them had the faintest idea. But that wasn't the most shocking part. What they didn't know was that Jacob had already seen the worst of people. He'd lived through loss, through tragedy, and yet he remained humble. A kindness in him, a quiet faith, made him stand apart in a world that had forgotten how to care for others. And tonight, in this very restaurant, as the chaos of wealth and privilege swirled around him, Jacob would be tested in ways he could never have imagined. A frail, homeless man, tattered clothes, thin and weary, staggered through the door. He shuffled toward the bar, asking for nothing more than a glass of water. The rest of the restaurant ignored him. They didn't even glance in his direction, as if he were nothing more than a shadow in the corner. But Jacob saw him. Jacob didn't turn away. Instead, he walked over to the man, his eyes steady, and quietly paid for a meal. No one saw this. No one knew. He simply helped. And that small act, an act of kindness that no one witnessed, was about to shake the foundation of everything. And it wouldn't stop there. The tension in the room was building, shifting like the tide before a storm. As Jacob's quiet kindness made ripples behind the scenes, his true test of character would come. Little did they know, their treatment of him, of the very man they dismissed as insignificant, would soon be put to the ultimate test. The stage was set, and their world would never be the same. Jacob Miller stood at the edge of the room, eyes steady, never wavering. He was a 34-year-old man, the embodiment of quiet strength. Yet, if you asked the people in that restaurant, if you asked anyone who passed through the doors of Le Grand Royale, they would never have known the true power behind the humble waiters standing before them. In the heart of Manhattan, in one of the most prestigious dining spots in the city, Jacob worked tirelessly, serving plates, clearing tables, never once drawing attention to himself. But his story was unlike any of theirs. It wasn't told in the flash of a diamond or the brand of a suit. It was etched into his soul, carved into every step he took, every action he made. Jacob was born into wealth, into a world where money was never an issue. His parents had built an empire, one that stretched across industries and continents. By the time he was 19, Jacob was already set to inherit it all, a billion-dollar business, more assets than most could dream of. The world should have been at his feet. But in a moment, that world shattered. He lost both his parents in a tragic accident, leaving him alone with a fortune that seemed too heavy to bear. The future he had been born into, the one filled with luxury and ease, suddenly felt suffocating, meaningless. Jacob had always known something deeper, something beyond the pursuit of wealth. His faith in Jesus had always been the quiet strength that guided him. It was this faith, this unwavering belief in humility, that led him to a decision few would ever make. Jacob chose to step away from his inheritance. He didn't want to be defined by the billions of dollars he'd inherited, nor by the world that would expect him to live in its image. Instead, he sought something more profound, true humility, service, and the understanding of people. Behind the scenes, Jacob still ran his empire. His company had flourished under the watch of a trusted CEO, but Jacob remained hidden, orchestrating the moves from the shadows. To the outside world, he was simply a waiter. But to those who truly knew him, he was something else entirely. And yet, as much as he tried to live a life of humility, the world around him made that difficult. It was a constant challenge, a never-ending test of character. He was surrounded by people who lived for wealth, who measured everything by status and power, people who would never understand the quiet strength he carried. And it was in this world, this very restaurant, that Jacob was forced to confront the constant clash of his faith and the treatment he received from others. There was Tony Benson, the manager of Le Grand Royale, a man who lived and breathed money. His arrogance knew no bounds. He treated Jacob like a pawn in his game of prestige. Tony's every word dripped with condescension, every action fueled by self-interest. "Stop acting like you matter," he'd sneer whenever Jacob tried to do more than the minimum required. Tony had no time for anyone who didn't contribute to his vision of wealth and success. To him, Jacob was just another cog in the machine, a worker who didn't even deserve to be seen. Then there was Olivia Carter, a regular diner at the restaurant, wealthy and entitled. She always came with demands, extra service, special treatment, attention at every moment. To her, the world revolved around her desires, and she expected everyone else to adjust to fit her needs. When Jacob was assigned to her table, she often humiliated him, expecting him to jump at her every whim, never acknowledging the quiet strength behind his eyes. She thought him beneath her, not even a human being to be considered, just another servant to order around. But it wasn't all like that. In the dark corners of the kitchen, there was Miguel, the dishwasher. A struggling single father working to support his children, Miguel had been through his own share of hardship. He was the only one who truly understood Jacob's quiet nature, the only one who could see the depth of his character beyond the uniform. They had become fast friends, despite their differences in status, because they shared a simple truth: kindness mattered more than anything else. Miguel knew what it was like to be looked down on. He knew the weight of struggle, the pain of not having enough, but still, he believed in the goodness of people. Jacob's faith was tested daily, but it was Miguel's friendship that reminded him why he had chosen this path. He had given up the comforts of wealth, the luxury of an easy life, to be among the forgotten, the overlooked. He was living proof that true wealth was never measured in dollars, but in the way one treated others. But the struggle was real. Every day, Jacob had to fight against the temptation to let the world around him dictate his actions, to give in to the arrogance that seemed to flood every corner of his life. His faith in Jesus, the belief that the humble would be exalted, was the only thing that kept him grounded. Every time he was belittled, every time he was ignored, he found solace in the words of Matthew 23 verse 12. "Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted." It wasn't easy. The world he was living in was far from forgiving. But Jacob never let go of his purpose. He knew the price of true humility. It was more than just enduring the disdain of others. It was about serving with a heart that refused to be poisoned by the bitterness around him. And while Jacob stood silently behind the scenes, watching as others reveled in their wealth, the world around him was about to change forever. Because the kindness he had shown, the quiet strength he embodied, was about to face a test unlike any other. The challenges would grow, and with them, the stakes. But Jacob was ready. For in the deepest part of his soul, he knew one thing: the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. And Jacob's heart was a treasure greater than any fortune the world could offer. It was a night like any other, yet it felt different. The air in Le Grand Royale buzzed with a certain electricity, an undercurrent of anticipation that couldn't be ignored. Word had spread quickly among the staff. Robert Sinclair, a powerful investor, a titan of industry, was coming for dinner. He had a reputation that preceded him, a man whose decisions could shape markets, whose investments were worth billions. This dinner wasn't just another night at the restaurant. This was a moment that could define the future of the entire business. The staff was on edge, scrambling to put on their best performance. The polished floors gleamed, the crystal glasses shone brightly, and the soft glow of candlelight cast elegant shadows across the dining room. The fine china was set to perfection, and every staff member was instructed to be at their absolute best. Jacob, as usual, worked quietly, his uniform crisp and unassuming. He watched as the rest of the restaurant staff flocked around Robert Sinclair like bees to honey. It was the usual dance of flattery, the careful deference to power and money. Tony Benson, the manager, nearly tripped over himself trying to impress Sinclair, his voice dripping with false sincerity. Olivia Carter, ever the socialite, fluttered around the investor, eager to be seen in his orbit, offering her most disarming smile. Jacob, in the corner, silently moved through the room, taking orders, delivering food, never drawing attention to himself. But even as he worked, he couldn't help but feel the tension in the air. Something was different tonight. The way the staff behaved around Robert Sinclair spoke volumes. They weren't just eager to serve, they were desperate. Desperate to be seen, desperate to please. They weren't treating him like a man. They were treating him like a stepping stone. And then it happened. As the evening went on, Jacob overheard a conversation between Robert Sinclair and Tony Benson. It wasn't meant for his ears, but the words cut through the noise like a knife. They were sitting at a private table in the corner, the rest of the restaurant's hum fading into the background. Robert Sinclair was speaking loudly enough for others to hear, and his words echoed with the rawness of disdain. "Look at these people, Tony," Sinclair said, his voice dripping with contempt. "They think they're above it all, don't they? These waiters, these cooks. You can see it in their eyes. They think they're a part of something important. But they're just here to make us feel good. Their lives don't matter. They're expendable." Tony laughed along, eager to join in, though his laugh was strained, the kind that came from someone who had long ago sold their soul for a chance at the high life. Jacob's hands froze as he set a tray down. The words, though not directed at him, stung like venom. The reality of the world he had chosen to live in, this world that placed value on money and power above everything else, had never been clearer. And for the first time in a long while, Jacob felt a surge of something deep within him, a quiet, burning fire. He took a breath, gathering his thoughts. This wasn't right. The very foundation of the world they were living in, this restaurant, this society, was built on the lie that people like Robert Sinclair were somehow better than those who served them. That wealth, status, and influence made one person more valuable than another. As he approached the table to clear the dishes, he made sure to stand a little taller, his back straight. His movements were deliberate, calm. He wasn't here to please them. He was here to serve, to show them something that none of them could see. Robert Sinclair glanced up as Jacob passed by, eyes cold, dismissive. He was already lost in his own world, toying with the rich appetizers, judging them as if he could buy them with a snap of his fingers. Jacob's voice, when it came, was quiet but steady, piercing through the chatter. "True wealth isn't in money," he said, his words echoing around the table. "True wealth is in how we treat others, in kindness, humility, and service, not in who we can step on to get ahead." The room fell silent, the words hanging in the air like a thick fog. Even Tony Benson froze, a look of confusion passing over his face. Robert Sinclair's eyes narrowed, his gaze briefly flicking to Jacob with something like disdain. "You've got a lot of nerve, don't you?" Robert scoffed, leaning back in his chair, his face twisting into an expression of amusement, though his voice was laced with irritation. "You think a waiter has the right to lecture me? A mere servant." But Jacob stood firm, unflinching. His eyes met Robert's, calm and unwavering. "I think," Jacob continued, "that no matter how much money you have, you're still a man. And if you think for 1 second that the value of a person is defined by their bank account, then you've missed the point of it all." There was a pause, longer than it should have been. The weight of Jacob's words seemed to hang in the air like a question that no one wanted to answer. Tony cleared his throat nervously, shifting in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. Olivia, who had been silently watching, raised an eyebrow in surprise. Robert Sinclair's lips curled into a tight smile, one that was more condescending than amused. He shook his head, muttering under his breath, "What does a waiter know about wealth, about life? Just another fool talking big because he's got nothing else to cling to." And just like that, the moment passed. The tension in the air dissipated as quickly as it had arrived, and the staff resumed their frantic attempts to please Sinclair. Jacob, however, felt something stir deep within him, a sense that maybe, just maybe, his words had struck a chord, even if only for a brief moment. He moved on, clearing plates, continuing with his work. But in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Sinclair had dismissed him, laughed off his words, but there was something in his eyes, something behind the smile, that suggested he wasn't as unaffected as he pretended to be. And as the night wore on, Jacob couldn't help but wonder, why had Robert Sinclair listened? Why had he not simply ignored him like everyone else? The answer didn't come immediately, but Jacob had a quiet knowing. The stage was set for something bigger, and Jacob, the man they thought they knew, was about to show them that the value of a person is never defined by what others can see. Better is a little with righteousness than great revenues with injustice. Proverbs 16:8. The evening had only just begun, But for Jacob, the first steps of a far greater journey had already been taken. Are you enjoying this story so far? Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Also, check out our ebooks. You can get them from the link in the description of this video. The days following Jacob's confrontation with Robert Sinclair were quiet, but not peaceful. The storm was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. As the world around him continued its frantic pursuit of wealth and status, Jacob stood as a silent testament to something far greater, something beyond their comprehension. But the more he resisted, the more the weight of the world pressed down on him. Tony Benson, the manager, could sense it. Jacob's calm, quiet defiance, his refusal to fall in line with the expectations of those in power, was a threat. And Tony was a man who hated threats, even subtle ones. So he decided to make an example of Jacob. One afternoon, as Jacob was arranging the wine list, Tony cornered him in the staff hallway. His eyes burned with a mixture of annoyance and something deeper, something darker. "Stop acting like you matter," Tony spat, his words sharp as daggers. "You're just a waiter, Jacob. Remember your place. People like you don't get to speak that way. People like you are meant to serve, not lecture. Don't forget that." Jacob didn't flinch. His eyes remained steady, unwavering. Tony's words, though biting, were nothing compared to the quiet strength Jacob had built over the years. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that the target on his back had just grown larger. Every action he took, every word he spoke, was being watched now, scrutinized. But Jacob wasn't here to make friends with the powerful. He was here to serve. And that's exactly what he did. Every day, every moment. He served with humility, regardless of the disdain that Tony and others poured out on him. It didn't take long for the next challenge to come. Olivia Carter, the wealthy socialite who always demanded more than what was offered, was back. She was a regular at the restaurant, always expecting special treatment, always quick to belittle the staff when they didn't meet her expectations. Today was no different. She sat in her usual corner booth, glaring over the menu as if it owed her an apology. When Jacob approached, she didn't greet him with the usual forced pleasantries. Instead, she scowled. "This is cold," she snapped, her voice dripping with disdain as she pushed her plate aside. "Redo it. And make sure it's hot this time." Jacob nodded, his face betraying nothing but professionalism. But as he turned away to head back to the kitchen, the words of Tony Benson echoed in his mind. "You're just a waiter." He felt the weight of those words now, more than ever. But he didn't let it break him. He went back to the kitchen, placed a new order, and returned with the same meal, perfectly cooked, as requested. Yet it wasn't enough. Olivia looked at the plate in front of her and scoffed. "I wanted it perfect," she sneered. "Try again. And you better make sure it's actually perfect this time." Jacob's heart sank, but he did what he had to do. Another trip to the kitchen. Another round of careful preparation. He came back, but Olivia was relentless. This went on for over an hour, 5 rounds, 5 times redoing the same order. By the time Jacob placed the final plate on the table, Olivia didn't even look at him. She pushed it aside with a dismissive wave, as if he were nothing more than a servant who had failed to meet her lofty expectations. Finally, when the meal was over, she didn't offer a tip, not even a single dollar. She simply left, leaving Jacob with the empty plate and a bruised spirit. No tip, no gratitude, just cold indifference. The humiliation stung, but Jacob didn't let it show. He silently cleared the table and moved on, but the weight of the moment pressed hard on his heart. Was this really how people viewed him? Was he destined to be nothing more than a nameless face in the crowd, overlooked and trampled on by those who couldn't be bothered to care? As the night wore on, he found solace in the quiet interactions he had with others. The other staff members, though distant, acknowledged him with a nod of respect. But Jacob knew that wasn't enough. He needed more. He needed to make a difference. That evening, after his shift ended, Jacob walked to the back of the restaurant where he found Miguel, the dishwasher, a quiet, hard-working man who had become his only true friend at Le Grand Royale. Miguel was struggling. His face was etched with worry as he sifted through a pile of bills. "Jacob," Miguel said quietly, his voice thick with the weight of fear. "They're sending eviction notices. My landlord. He says I have until next week to pay up or they're kicking me out. I don't know what to do. I'm doing my best, but—" His voice trailed off, and the helplessness in his eyes said more than words ever could. Jacob's heart broke. He had seen Miguel struggle, working long hours at the restaurant, doing his best to support his family. Yet here he was, drowning in debts he couldn't possibly pay. Without a second thought, Jacob reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick envelope. He slipped it into Miguel's locker, knowing Miguel would never ask for it. He didn't need to. As Jacob walked away, he whispered a silent prayer. God, I know this is just a small act, but I hope it's enough. Later that evening, as Jacob walked out of the restaurant, he spotted the old homeless man. The one he had helped earlier with the water, the one who had quietly prayed in the corner, unnoticed by everyone else. This time, the man wasn't sitting on the curb. He was standing near the entrance, eyes closed, as though he were deep in thought. The old man smiled, his eyes twinkling with a wisdom that came from somewhere far beyond this world. That's the key, son. You don't need to know the end. You just need to keep walking. As Jacob turned to leave, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of peace settle over him. Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. 1 Peter 5 verse 6. Jacob didn't know what the future held, but he was certain of one thing. God saw him. And when the time came, he would lift him up. And as for the rest of the world, they could keep their empty riches and their fleeting power. Jacob knew something they didn't. True wealth isn't in money, it's in faith in Jesus Christ. And that was a treasure that could never be taken away. If you're still watching, comment, God lifts the humble. The tension in the restaurant was palpable. Each day had been a test, each encounter a trial of patience and character. Jacob's life in the shadows was starting to feel unbearable, as if the weight of his own humility was pushing him to the brink. But little did he know, this moment, this particular night, would be the turning point. It started like any other evening. The lights dimmed, the soft hum of conversation filled the air, and the elegant clink of silverware against fine china was the soundtrack to the bustling restaurant. Jacob moved among the tables, effortlessly serving with a quiet grace, though his thoughts were heavy. The loneliness of his secret was beginning to eat at him. And then, Robert Sinclair walked in. Robert, the wealthy investor, the man who had belittled the workers, the one who had scoffed at Jacob's words about wealth being more than just money. He was back. But this time, he wasn't alone. At first, Jacob didn't recognize the man accompanying Robert. He was sharply dressed in a tailored suit, the kind that screamed power, but there was something about his presence that set him apart from the others who frequented Le Grand Royale. He exuded an air of calm confidence, the kind of quiet authority that made you wonder what he was truly capable of. Robert greeted the staff with the usual haughty smile, the one that never quite reached his eyes. As he sat down, he began to talk in low tones, discussing business with his companion. Jacob could barely hear their conversation, but he didn't need to. What Robert said next, though, was impossible to miss. "I've got my eye on a small company," Robert said, his voice tinged with mockery. "Poor little thing, barely holding itself together. The owner is struggling, must be on the brink of bankruptcy. I'll buy them out, no problem. What's the use of keeping them around? Really? Let them crash. It'll be easier to swoop in and pick up the pieces." He laughed, a cold, empty sound that echoed in Jacob's ears. There was no empathy in his voice, no sense of the dignity that should accompany even the smallest business venture. Just a sense of entitlement, of dominance, of wealth used as a tool to crush others. Jacob's heart sank, but he stood still, his mind racing. He had heard those words before, the words of a man who thought that the value of others was determined by their wealth. It wasn't new, but it hit differently now, because Jacob knew what Robert didn't. That's when Jacob's business partner walked in. The man's presence seemed to command the room, his every step calculated, his gaze sharp. He scanned the restaurant briefly before making his way to Robert's table. Robert stood to greet him, a broad grin spreading across his face as they exchanged pleasantries. But the real shock came when Robert introduced him to the staff. "Gentlemen," Robert said, his voice booming. "Meet my co-founder, Jacob Miller." For a moment, the world stood still. Jacob Miller? The same Jacob Miller who had served them dinner countless times? The same humble waiter who had been mistreated, belittled, and dismissed? The same man who was invisible in the eyes of the very people he served? The room fell into an eerie silence. Waiters froze mid-step. Tony, the manager, stood motionless, his mouth hanging slightly open. Olivia, who had treated Jacob with such disdain, blinked in disbelief, her expression transforming from smugness to sheer astonishment. Even the patrons at nearby tables, accustomed to the constant flow of luxury, now looked up from their meals in shock. Jacob remained calm, his face betraying nothing. But inside, his heart was beating wildly. He hadn't wanted this. He hadn't wanted the attention, the recognition. He didn't seek admiration or praise. He had only ever wanted to serve, to live with purpose. But in this moment, everything had changed. The truth was out. Jacob Miller wasn't just the humble waiter they'd all taken for granted. He was the owner of a billion-dollar business. He looked at each of them, Tony, Olivia, Robert, and the rest, his gaze steady and unwavering. And in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. They saw him, really saw him, for the first time. But it wasn't awe or admiration that they felt. It was the weight of shame, the cold sting of recognition. They had treated him like nothing more than a servant, a mere cog in the machine. But in truth, he was their equal, their superior in ways they couldn't begin to understand. Jacob had always known that what mattered most in life wasn't the size of one's bank account, or the name on the door, or the social status attached to a title. What mattered was character, integrity, how you treated others, how you showed up when no one was watching, how you held yourself when the world tried to crush you beneath its heel. And now, as the truth settled in the room like an unspoken thunderstorm, Jacob's quiet resolve began to shine even brighter. But this moment, this revelation, wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. 1 Samuel 16 verse 7. The same man they had mocked, the man they had looked down upon, was the owner of more wealth both in material and character than they could ever fathom. But Jacob's test of character wasn't over yet. This revelation had shaken them. But Jacob's true test was still to come. And as the night wore on, Jacob remained still in the face of their shock. He wasn't interested in flaunting his wealth. He wasn't interested in seeking revenge. He simply wanted to continue living his truth, serving others, and embodying the faith that had guided him all along. The real question now wasn't how they would react to him. It was whether he could still hold on to the humility that had defined him before all of this. The storm was far from over. The air was thick with tension. It had only been a few minutes since Jacob's identity had been exposed to the entire room, and already the environment had shifted. No longer was Jacob the invisible, unnoticed waiter, the man who was easily dismissed. Now, the weight of his wealth was too glaring for anyone to ignore. Yet, in the wake of the revelation, something unexpected happened. Jacob had been hoping for a quiet evening, for a moment to gather his thoughts, perhaps slip back into the shadows where he felt most comfortable. But as he returned to his duties, he could feel the eyes of the staff on him, the weight of their guilt pressing down upon them. It didn't take long before Tony, the manager, approached him with a frantic expression, his eyes darting nervously as he tried to mask the desperation in his voice. "Jacob," Tony began, his voice shaky, I didn't know. I'm sorry, okay? I was wrong. I should have never treated you like that. Listen, I can make this right. I can offer you a promotion. You know I have connections, I can get you anything you want. You deserve better than this, man. Please, just say the word and you can have it all." Tony's words were hasty, almost pleading. He had seen his own position in jeopardy, now that Jacob had proven he was more than just a waiter. He was a billionaire, someone who could easily ruin Tony's career with a snap of his fingers. The truth was, Tony had never thought Jacob was capable of making such a move. Jacob had always been just a humble server, someone beneath him. But now, faced with the consequences of his own arrogance, Tony's tone had shifted. Now, he was desperate to climb back into Jacob's favor. Jacob, however, did not flinch. He met Tony's gaze, his eyes calm and steady. He could see the fear and the greed in Tony's eyes. This wasn't about an apology. It was about saving face, about securing power. And Jacob knew that. He knew exactly what Tony was asking for. But Jacob wasn't interested in power. Not in the way Tony was. Jacob's response was simple. "My worth isn't in money," he said quietly. "It's in my faith and how I serve others. A promotion won't change who I am. It won't change what matters." Tony stood frozen, his mouth agape, unable to comprehend the depth of Jacob's words. For a brief moment, Jacob wondered if the man was even capable of understanding the truth that he had just spoken. But instead of lashing out, instead of throwing his weight around, Jacob turned and walked away, leaving Tony in stunned silence. As Jacob made his way to the kitchen, he was met with a far more unexpected figure, Olivia Carter, the wealthy diner who had always treated him with disdain, who had often made his life at Le Grand Royale even more difficult. She had been one of the most vocal in her condescension toward him. But now, her approach was different. She smiled, her usual air of entitlement replaced with an almost nervous charm. "Jacob," she said softly, I had no idea who you were. I'm sorry. I've been so wrong. I'd love to make it up to you. Would you, maybe, go to dinner with me sometime?" Her words hung in the air, a strange combination of flattery and self-interest. Jacob saw right through it. She wasn't truly apologizing. No, this was an opportunity for her to associate herself with power, to gain favor with someone who could elevate her status. And Jacob knew it. Still, he didn't respond with anger. He didn't accuse her or belittle her in return. Instead, he spoke gently but firmly. "Olivia," he said, his voice steady, "I've learned that true worth isn't found in what people can give you. It's found in how you serve them and how you love them. And my decision isn't about money or status. It's about living out the values I hold dear. I don't need anyone's approval or validation." Olivia's smile faltered for just a second, but she quickly regained composure, nodding, though there was no genuine warmth in her gaze. Jacob could tell that her apology was more for herself than for him, but he wasn't concerned with her motives. His heart was set on something else. Now, Jacob found himself standing at a crossroads, his character, his very soul, about to be tested. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him. He had the power now to exact revenge, to get back at Tony and Olivia for the years of mistreatment, to use his wealth and status to crush them beneath him. It would be easy. It would feel good, even satisfying. But Jacob knew better. He had been given a gift, yes, a gift of wealth, a gift of influence. But that wasn't where his strength lay. His strength lay in his ability to forgive, to live out the teachings of Jesus, to love his enemies. In the quiet of the kitchen, as he stood there contemplating his next move, Jacob closed his eyes and prayed. His heart was heavy, but his resolve was firm. He asked God for the strength to show mercy. He asked for the courage to do what was right, even if it meant taking the harder path. And as he opened his eyes, he knew what he had to do. Tony's fate, like Olivia's, was no longer in Jacob's hands. But there was one person Jacob could help, one person who had always treated him with kindness, even when the world around him hadn't. Miguel. Jacob walked into the back room, where Miguel was working, exhausted and with a weary look on his face. The dishwasher had always been a quiet friend, someone who had never expected anything from Jacob, yet always offered him genuine companionship. Miguel, a struggling single father, had worked tirelessly to make ends meet, always keeping his head down and staying humble. Miguel didn't ask for help, but Jacob knew what he needed. Jacob slipped an envelope into Miguel's locker, knowing that this small act would change his life. Inside was enough money to pay for months of rent, enough to keep Miguel and his children safe from eviction. As Miguel opened the envelope, his eyes filled with tears. He didn't understand at first, but Jacob just smiled, offering no explanation, just a silent nod of understanding. This wasn't about showing off wealth. This was about lifting someone else up. But love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Then your reward will be great. Luke 6 verse 35. Jacob walked out of the kitchen, his heart light. He hadn't used his wealth to humiliate, to punish, or to destroy. Instead, he had chosen to build others up, to live out the very principles that defined him. The world would know Jacob Miller not for his billions, but for his compassion, not for his power, but for his humility. And that, in the end, was the true test. As he left the restaurant that night, his footsteps steady and sure, Jacob knew that his journey was far from over. It wasn't about what he had or what he could take from others. It was about what he could give. It was about faith, about service, and above all, about love. The story of Jacob Miller wasn't over. His greatest challenges and his greatest triumphs still lay ahead. Weeks passed since the evening of Jacob's quiet, yet powerful choices. As the days unfolded, the lessons Jacob had chosen to live by, humility, kindness, and mercy, began to manifest in ways he had never anticipated. It was as though the ripple effect of his actions, of his decision to forgive rather than to retaliate, began to touch the lives of everyone around him. Jacob, who had once hidden in the shadows, now stood in the light. The once humble waiter, now known for his extraordinary wealth, began using his resources not for self-indulgence, but to uplift those who had been overlooked, to provide for those who had always gone unnoticed. He began by helping the struggling workers in his restaurant, those who, like Miguel, had been invisible in the eyes of the world. He implemented policies that ensured fair wages, provided health benefits for the employees, and even opened up scholarships for their children, empowering them with opportunities they had never before dared to dream. Jacob's generosity did not stop there. He reached out to local communities, funding education programs, providing support for single mothers, and even sponsoring healthcare initiatives for the homeless. His wealth became a tool for transformation, not just for himself, but for others. And in each act, Jacob remembered the core principle that had shaped his life. It's not about how much you have, but how much you're willing to give. Meanwhile, his past was quietly unraveling. The homeless man, the one Jacob had helped in his moment of need, appeared again one rainy evening outside the restaurant. Jacob, as always, made his way outside to offer the man a warm meal, but this time, something extraordinary happened. As Jacob approached, the man looked up with a knowing smile, as though this moment had been destined long ago. "Jacob," the man spoke softly, his voice rich with warmth, "I've been waiting for you." Jacob paused, his heart racing. There was something familiar in the man's eyes, something deeply comforting. The man leaned forward, revealing a small worn Bible in his hands. "I knew your father," he said, a quiet reverence in his voice. "I was his mentor, and he was mine. He taught me everything I know about faith, about living a life of service. He would be so proud of you." Jacob's heart tightened in his chest. He had always known his father had been a man of faith, a man who had believed in the power of helping others. But hearing it from this stranger, this man who had, by chance, been the very one Jacob had helped, was like a final, sacred confirmation. The man was no longer a homeless figure, but a shepherd, a spiritual guide in disguise. His identity now revealed, the man introduced himself as Pastor Samuel. He explained that after Jacob's father passed away, he had devoted his life to traveling the world, helping those who were most in need. He had seen Jacob's journey from afar, praying for him, even as he carried on his father's legacy. "You've walked the path your father would have chosen for you, Jacob," Pastor Samuel said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "You've chosen humility over pride, service over self-interest. You've made him proud." The weight of those words settled deep within Jacob's heart. It wasn't the riches that had made him wealthy. It was the love and care he had for others that had enriched his life more than money ever could. And then, the most surprising transformation took place. Jacob's story began to affect those who had once treated him with disdain. Tony, the manager who had once mocked him, who had dismissed him as a mere servant, began showing up at church. Every Sunday, he would take a seat in the back row, his eyes full of quiet contemplation. Jacob had no expectation of change from Tony. But in time, Tony's heart began to shift. He had witnessed Jacob's consistent actions, his unwavering commitment to humility. He had seen the power of kindness, not just as a concept, but as a lifestyle. One morning, Tony approached Jacob after church, his eyes red from what seemed like a sleepless night. "Jacob," Tony began, his voice shaky, "I've been coming here for a few weeks now. And I don't have all the answers yet, but I think I'm starting to understand. I've been so wrong about everything. Your life has shown me what truly matters. Not money, not status, but faith and service." Jacob smiled, his eyes filled with compassion. "It's not too late, Tony. No one's journey is finished until their last breath. It's never too late to change." Tony nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. And with that, the man who had once been driven by ambition and greed began to walk a new path, a path of redemption. Olivia, too, began to change. She had never before known the true meaning of selflessness, of reaching out to those in need without expecting anything in return. But as she watched Jacob's quiet acts of generosity, as she saw the transformation in the people around him, her heart began to soften. One evening, Jacob received a call from Olivia. Her voice was different, more grounded than he had ever heard it before. "Jacob, I need to tell you something," she said, a hint of uncertainty in her tone. "I've been volunteering at a shelter for the past few weeks. It's not much, but I've seen lives being changed, real lives. And I've been wrong. You were right all along." Jacob's heart lifted. "I'm glad you're finding purpose in that, Olivia. It's a beautiful thing to serve others. You're not alone in that. Thank you for showing me that. I wouldn't have known where to start without you," she admitted quietly. As the days passed, Jacob's life continued to reflect the values that had carried him through the darkest moments. The importance of loving others, regardless of their status, their wealth, or their position in life. He never sought recognition or fame. He simply lived according to the truth he held dear, that true greatness lies in serving, in humbling oneself before others, in being kind when the world seems indifferent. Let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Matthew 5 verse 16. Jacob's story, however, wasn't just about changing the lives of others. It was a testament to the power of transformation, to the healing power of love and forgiveness. Jesus humbled himself to serve, and Jacob had followed his example. In the process, he had uplifted others, showing them the beauty of living a life of purpose. Jacob's final words, the ones he shared with everyone who asked about his life, were always the same. Jesus humbled himself to serve. So who are we to think we're above anyone else? It's not about who you are or what you have. It's about what you give. And what you give can change the world. And in the end, Jacob Miller's life wasn't measured by his wealth. It was measured by the lives he touched, the hearts he healed, and the people he helped rise from the depths of despair into a brighter, more hopeful future. Because in the end, it's not about how high you climb. It's about how low you're willing to stoop to lift others up. As Jacob's story unfolded, it wasn't just his actions that captured the hearts of those around him. It was the transformation of those who watched him. Each step of his journey, each decision to serve over self, to love those others overlooked, was a testament to the power of faith and the resilience of the human spirit. But the most powerful part of his story? It's not over yet. What about you? What would you have done if you were in Jacob's shoes? Think about it. Imagine having the wealth and power to change the lives of those around you, to lift them from despair, but being faced with the decision to stay humble, to serve, to love instead of retaliate. Would you have acted the same way? Or would you have given in to the pressures of pride, revenge, or greed? We want to hear from you. Comment below and share your thoughts. Tell us, how has your faith shaped your choices when you've been underestimated, ignored, or mistreated? Have you ever had a moment where you had to choose humility over pride, where you had to put others first even when it was hard? Perhaps you've had a moment in your own life that resonates with Jacob's journey, where you've been looked down upon, but found the strength to rise. Or maybe you've faced adversity in a way that forced you to choose your faith over worldly desires. Your story matters, and it could inspire others who are facing their own challenges. As you reflect on this incredible journey of transformation, we encourage you to take action in your own life. Like this video if you believe that true greatness is found in humility, kindness, and service. Share this story with others who need a reminder of what real wealth looks like, not just in monetary terms, but in the heart. Let this story serve as a beacon of hope to those who are struggling to find their way. And most importantly, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss more stories that inspire you to live a life of purpose, faith, and compassion. Remember, Jacob's journey wasn't about seeking recognition or fame. It was about following the path of Jesus, who showed us that greatness is found in serving others, in choosing love when the world offers hate. It's about understanding that the true riches in life come not from what we possess, but from what we give. True riches are found in humility, kindness, and faith in Jesus Christ. In a world that often values power, status, and wealth, Jacob Miller reminds us that the true treasures in life come from serving others, living by faith, and sharing the love that Christ showed us. May you be inspired to live a life of humility, to rise above the world's distractions, and to treat every person you meet with the same love and respect that Jesus showed to all of us. Take the first step today. Start living with purpose and let your light shine before others. Thank you for watching. Stay humble, stay faithful, and remember, your story is just beginning.